The title of this presentation is Serial Killers in Alaska, Human Trafficking, and MMIP, How Bob Hansen Got Away with Murder, 1971 to 1983. The learning objectives are to gain a long-term overview of serial killers in Alaska, human trafficking, MMIP in Alaska, as well as a current status, challenges today, services for victims of crime, some tips on crime prevention in Alaska, and then there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the presentation. Viewer discretion is advised. The topics include serial killers, human trafficking, missing Indigenous persons, murdered Indigenous persons. This presentation may be upsetting for some. Viewer discretion is advised. This training is sponsored by Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association, the Alaska Native Justice Center, and the Standing Together for Our People STOP grant. A quick definition of serial killers: the killing of 3 or more persons over a period of more than 30 days, with a significant cooling off period between killings. It's important to emphasize that Alaska Native people have lived in Alaska for over 10,000 years as excellent parents and grandparents, protective of children and elders, teaching youth skills to survive and thrive, and how to survive against attacks, whether those attacks are from animals or human beings. Skills like traveling in two and being vigilant of our surroundings. Please take the pre-test and the pre and post survey so that I might issue you a certificate of training. Don't worry about writing everything down. This presentation covers a lot of ground. I have to talk fast to finish in time. There's a PDF available as well as a presentation on YouTube. And introduction: I was raised in Cold Bay on the Alaska Peninsula. Population of Cold Bay was 32. I was naive about crime. I was trusting of strangers. Thought all people were kind. I did not know about bad criminals, and I did not know about cruel people. At age 21, I joined the Unalaska Police Department and have served in Alaska for about 27 years as a police officer. I've been a victim of crime. I've had friends and relatives who are MMIP. I serve on the Healthy Relationship team at Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association. I have a master's degree in anthropology, a doctoral degree in education, and I've served as principal investigator with the National Science Foundation. Some of the best training I've had over the years was a course I attended in 1983. The course was titled Homicide and Sex Crimes. It was taught by the Federal Bureau of Investigations with world-class instructors like Special Agent Robert K. Ressler and Special Agent John Douglas. These investigators focused on learning as much as they could about serial killers, and they really did their homework and became global experts on the topic. I served with the Anchorage Police Department from 1983 to 2003 as a patrol officer and detective in several units, including robbery and sexual assault, crimes against children unit. I've assisted in the investigation of cold case homicides and serial killers. Worked on teams that involved up to 100 detectives from many agencies. These teams were well coordinated and focusing on the investigation of serial killers. Over the years, dating back to 1741, I've noticed recurring themes such as the get-rich-quick scheme at any cost, at the cost of human lives. These schemes began with sea otter furs, northern fur seals, and then expanded to gold and other natural resources into human trafficking and drugs, including opium, cocaine, pain pills, and fentanyl. The initial plan is quite often begins with kidnapping, but tragically ends up with homicides. In 1741, Europeans arrived in Alaska. There was 2 ships, the St. Peter and the St. Paul. There was about 80 men on each ship. They were heavily armed with pistols, rifles, cannons, knives, and swords. They also carried with them alcohol, tobacco, and Chinese charlogs, which is opium. That triad continues today. Sometimes it involves alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and drugs, but sometimes it just skips straight to drugs. Also on board, one of the ships was Swedish Lieutenant Sven Waxel. His journal was published. And in it, the intentions of the men on board were to kidnap Alaska Native women and to kill Alaska Native men. They wanted to do this so badly that Captain Commander Vitus Bering had to give them written orders: do not kidnap and do not kill. Swedish Lieutenant Sven Waxel said his men would have just as well have killed the savages. And when he was using the word savages, he was referring to the Alaska Natives in the Shumagon Islands near Bird Island. Savage is a code for non-human beings, and if non-human beings cannot be murdered. That's echoed strongly in the language of Bob Hansen from 1983, Alaska's most prolific serial killer. Bob Hansen said words to the effect of, you cannot murder a person involved in human trafficking. Russian Orthodox priest Ivan Veniaminov moved to Alaska in 1824 and lived there for 10 years. He kept a journal that was published under the title Notes on the Island of the Unalaska District. He recorded that the goal of the early Europeans was to exterminate the Alaskan Native people. The deeds of these first Russians towards the Aleuts were horrible. These men did not value much the life of an Aleut. In today's language, Alaska Native lives do not matter. It's important that I point out that all lives matter, whether they're Alaska Native or whether they're people involved in human trafficking, people who have gotten addicted to substances. All human lives matter. In his book, Father Veniaminov noted that two Russians in particular, Glotov and Solovyov, went rather beyond the limit, depopulated entire islands, island groups, and they focused on Unimak Islands and the islands of the Four Mountains. Some people might say, Mike, that was 200 years ago. People don't believe that same way today, but there may be people that still believe that people involved in human trafficking or addicted to alcohol or drugs are not human beings. Fast forwarding to the 1930s, when American anthropologist William Laughlin traveled to Unimak Island, and he archaeologically excavated one of the sites that documented what some of the oral tradition had said. The site was from 1764, a serial killing scene. Some 206 years later, William Laughlin found evidence of those homicides. And Laughlin noted that Veniaminov was inclined to believe that the number of Aleuts killed was in excess of 5,000. Glotov, Solovyov, and Pushkarev were apparently responsible for some 4,000 deaths. If those figures are accurate, each one of those men is responsible for 1,333 homicides apiece. As a point of reference, the number of missing Alaskans in 2023 is 1,322. So, again, in 1741, Europeans first arrived in Alaska. In 1745, Europeans returned to Attu Island, and their deeds are captured in geographical place names. Murder Point, Massacre Beach, Massacre Valley, Krasny Point. Krasny is Russian for red. The ocean water was so red off that point from the blood of Alaska Native people that they named it Red Point. In the 1760s, Unimak Island, where the Europeans systematically went from village to village and killed everybody, set the villages on fire to make sure everybody was dead, and then renamed the village Pogromny. Pogrom is an organized massacre. So along the entire 1,000 miles of the Aleutian Islands, there's histories of serial killers that's well documented in Veniaminov's book. In the 1890s, gold rushes began in Alaska. 1896, Klondike. 1898, Chilkoot. 1899, Nome. And this resulted in thousands of men with lots of money and few women. And as Lael Morgan, the author of Good Time Girls, noted, when there's lots of men with wealth and few women, there's an increase of human trafficking. And Lael Morgan says that the Good Time Girls bankrolled many early businesses in Alaska. The Red Light District was moved from Ship Creek, pushed south to 4th Avenue, then pushed farther south to 9th Avenue, pushed southwest to Spenard, and then east to Muldoon. These were known as a trap line, or in Anchorage and Fairbanks, a line. Quite often they recruited victims in human trafficking from Washington, Oregon, and California. And this continued from the late 1800s through the 1900s. Early Alaska law enforcement began in 1867 with the United States military, the United States Army, the United States Navy. 1884, the United States Marshal. 1920, Anchorage Police Department. 1941, the Alaska State Troopers. A quote from Alaska State Trooper United States Marshal in 1940. He said that there's no money. I know of several cases, particularly murders, where I'm sure I could run down the guilty party and bring him to justice if I had the funds with which to pursue the investigation, but I haven't. In 1952, the United States Federal Report on Human Trafficking in Alaska noted that exploiters take full advantage of Anchorage and Fairbanks. 1967, a quote from an Alaska State Trooper: "They could keep me busy full-time in the 1960s in Alaska. I could have made dozens of arrests on my last visit there, but there isn't time or money. I know of 5 deaths from questionable causes in the past year. None of these were investigated." In 1968, oil was discovered in Alaska, but the oil companies were not willing to drill wells or build a pipeline until it was decided who actually owns the land. 1971, United States President Richard Nixon signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Land title was resolved. This resulted in a rush of thousands of men to Alaska looking for get-rich-quick jobs. And when there was an increase in men and money, there was an increase in human trafficking, and communities and law enforcement turned a blind eye to human trafficking in Alaska. 1967, Bob Hansen moved to Alaska, and we'll go over his early life. Bob Hansen was born in 1939 in Iowa. He was raised in Pocahontas, Iowa. His mother was American. His father was Danish. He had a strict religious upbringing. His father ran a bakery shop. Bob Hansen was shy. He stuttered. He said he was bullied. People made fun of him at school. He says because of all the sweets he ate at his father's donut shop that he developed acne. He was turned down by women. In his life, the monster was school. At age 21, he was arrested for arson for setting the school barn and three buses in Iowa on fire. He spent 20 months in jail, was diagnosed with manic depression and schizophrenia. His first name, Christian, meant the follower of Christ. His middle name, Bose, in Danish means bad, evil, wild, or angry. I mentioned the slide at the beginning of this presentation had a cover of a book named Butcher Baker, a true account of a serial killer. The primary author on that book is Walt Gilmore, who was an Alaska State Trooper. And after this book was published by Gilmore and authored by Hale, at least three films spun off, including Frozen Ground with Nicolas Cage, The Butcher Baker, Mind of a Monster, and The Butcher Baker in Alaska. From the 1940s through the 1960s, Alaska had a basic tolerance towards human trafficking. A quote from Leland Hale, co-author of Butcher Baker: "There was a tolerance towards prostitution in Alaska that was not the same as it would be in some other places in the United States." So in 1967, Bob Hansen moved to Alaska. He was married, had 2 sons and a daughter. He first lived in Mountain View and then moved to Muldoon, had a house off of 9th and Muldoon on Old Harbor Avenue, a private one-family residence. He had a bakery at 9th and Ingra, and later on bought an airplane that he kept at Merrill Field. He was an avid animal hunter and got a thrill out of stealing. His bakery shop, the Hansen Bakery Shop, was at 9th and Ingra. This gave him quick and easy access to the 4th and 5th Avenue area. In the 1970s, there was tons of human trafficking going on 4th Avenue and 5th Avenue. This also gave him access to Merrill Field, where he stored his airplane, as well as the Seward Highway, where he could travel south of Anchorage to Seward and look for victims. A quote from Alaska State Trooper Walt Ironjaw Gilmore: later on, when Bob Hansen became a suspect in the serial killings, he said Bob Hansen had a criminal record as long as the Aleutian Islands, which are about 1,000 miles long. Part of this criminal history was on November 22nd, 1971. Bob Hansen was arrested for kidnapping a housewife and a real estate agent in the 3600 block of Lois Avenue. This is approximately in the Spenard area off of 36 in Minnesota. Bob Hansen was released on bail, and then just a few days later, November 19th, 1971, an 18-year-old female who was involved in human trafficking, who had substance abuse challenges, was kidnapped in downtown Anchorage in a parking lot, at gunpoint taken in a vehicle to Cooper Landing and assaulted. The 18-year-old was too terrified to report this to the police. She talked this man out of killing her. She is convinced that this man was Bob Hansen. She was too ashamed to report it to the police. Her father was an Alaska State Trooper, and she decided at that time to not file any report. But then tragically, just a few days later, on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1971, an 18-year-old female was found deceased in McHugh Creek just south of Anchorage. When the Alaska State Trooper victim who survived and found out about this. She recognized a pattern. She was convinced that the person responsible for the homicide of this 18-year-old female was Bob Hansen. This motivated her to report it to the police. She overcame her fears. She overcame her embarrassment. She did not want to see other people killed, and so she reported her kidnapping to the Alaska State Troopers. Eventually, in the 1980s, Bob Hansen was prosecuted. The prosecutor was Frank Rothschild, and Frank Rothschild said that Bob Hansen learned. He learned from the incidents in 1971 to be careful about the victims he chooses. That if the police believe nice girls, such as the real estate agent that Bob Hansen was charged with, but police do not believe people involved in human trafficking. The charge against Bob Hansen in 1971 against the woman who was a real estate agent stuck, but the charge against the 18-year-old woman were dismissed. So Rothschild said from that Bob Hansen learned to more carefully pick victims. Anchorage Police Captain Ron Rice said it more strongly. He said, "We taught Bob Hansen how to kill when we didn't put him away for a long time. We not only taught him to kill, we taught him who to kill. Taught him that it's all right to kill people involved in human trafficking because nobody cares about human traffickers." So in the 1970s, Bob Hansen's residence was off of Muldoon and Old Harbor, south of Creekside Park Elementary, north of Walmart today. Walmart and Fred Meyer's weren't there back in the 70s, but they're there today. Single-family residence built in the 1960s, three-bedroom residence with a basement. One of Bob Hansen's other arrests was a 1976 arrest from Fred Meyer's. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, required to have psychiatric care. The Alaska court overturned his sentence, and Bob Hansen was out in 15 months and on the streets to commit more crimes. It's important again to emphasize in the 1960s through the 1980s, human trafficking in Anchorage and other locations in Alaska was out in the open. There was lots of money involved, organized crime, and communities and police turned a blind eye, tolerated crime. In 1981, Bob Hansen filed a false report saying his residence was burglarized and that his taxidermy mounts were stolen, his mountain goat mounts, his bird mounts, and fish mounts. He filed a police report, and then he filed a claim with his insurance company. He got $13,000, which he used to buy a new airplane, a Super Cub. In 1983, a kidnapping victim who survived described his basement with the goat mounts and the bird mounts and the fish mounts. And so all those items that he reported stolen and that he got money for were still in the house, and that formed a foundation for a theft charge. June 13th, 1983, a 17-year-old girl involved in trafficking was on Denali between 4th Avenue and 5th Avenue at the corners. Bob Hansen was out on the prowl. He pulled up to her in his vehicle. They had communication. They agreed for $200 for a sex act. She got into the vehicle. He overpowered her, handcuffed her, and took her to his residence on Muldoon. So this map shows the traffic pattern that Bob Hansen would follow many, many times from 4th and 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue to the highway to Muldoon to his residence, and then back out to Muldoon to DeBar to Merrifield where his airplane was stored. That 17-year-old girl realized that Bob Hansen had killed people before and that he was going to kill her if she didn't take quick action. As he was loading items from his vehicle into his plane at Merrifield, she saw an opportunity to escape. She bolted. She ran from his vehicle, naked, handcuffed, flagged down a citizen, and ultimately reported the kidnapping to the Anchorage Police Department. How did APD investigate Bob Hansen? They did a lousy job. They had a bad attitude. They tragically believed Bob Hansen. Bob Hansen had an alibi, a prominent member of the Anchorage community involved in the insurance industry. Tragically, the Anchorage Police Department detective assigned to the case believed Bob Hansen and did not believe the 17-year-old traffic victim. As Anchorage Police Detective Maxine Farrell said, Anchorage Police Department did a really lousy job. Anchorage police officer named Greg Baker did a very brave thing. He risked his police career. He took the reports from the Anchorage Police Department to the Alaska State Troopers. The Alaska State Troopers, the case was assigned to Trooper Glenn Flothy, who did an excellent job. One of the victims who survived, as I mentioned, was a daughter of an Alaska State Trooper By now, bodies were being found in shallow graves out at Knik River. There was 223 brass found in those bodies that the Alaska State Troopers were anxious to connect back to the suspect. Glenn Flothy took his report to the Anchorage District Attorney's Office. Their response was basically that we don't have time, we don't have attorneys to assist you, you don't have enough probable cause. What's more important than an active serial killer? Captain Ron Rice of the Anchorage Police Department said it's a little club down there. The DA gave a cold shoulder. He's more interested in making deals with Hansen's attorney. So what else is new? It's a little club down there. The Alaska State Troopers could have given up. They could have said, well, we took it to the DA. The DA said there's not enough. There's no more we can do. But the motto of the Alaska State Troopers is never, 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 never give up. They started tailing Bob Hansen, following him everywhere he went, to his house, to his business, his plane to Merrill Field. When Bob Hansen launched his plane, troopers would launch another plane. There's a real risk in tailing suspects in that they may realize that they're being followed, and they might start destroying evidence. The Alaska State Troopers did a wise thing. They went district attorney shopping. They went to Fairbanks, contacted DA Pat Dugan, flew him down to Fairbanks to the trooper headquarters, sat him down an old-fashioned typewriter. All Friday evening, all Saturday, most of Sunday, DA Pat Dugan and Trooper Glenn Flothy typed out an extensive affidavit detailing all of the evidence they had that indicated why they believed that Bob Hansen was the suspect in the case. This affidavit was eventually taken before Anchorage Judge Victor Carlson, who carefully reviewed it and agreed that there was enough evidence. He issued a search warrant and ordered the Alaska State Troopers to search Bob Hansen's residence, his business, his vehicle's plane, his alibis, for evidence of homicide. The Alaska State Troopers went to Bob Hansen's residence in the 7200 block of Old Harbor. They searched it for over 10 hours and did not find any evidence that they anticipated to find. A relatively small residence for 10 hours with many state troopers searching, you would think they would begin finding evidence, but they started worrying that maybe Bob Hansen realized he was being tailed and that he destroyed all of the evidence. But their motto was never give up, and they kept searching. And eventually behind the headboard of his bed, they found a map with marks on it, an aeronautical map. Eventually Bob Hansen, all the blue marks on the map, he admitted were victims of homicide, people who were involved in human trafficking, and he accepted responsibility for 17 homicides. The additional 7 marks were people not involved in human trafficking, and he adamantly denied being responsible for those homicides. In Bob Hansen's mind, in Bob Hansen's world, people involved in human trafficking are not humans, and it's okay to kill them. It's important to point out that Bob Hansen's way of thinking is wrong. All people are human beings. Nobody deserves to be murdered. After the state troopers peeled back the insulation in Bob Hansen's attic, they found a second aeronautical map with 24 marks on it, as well as a Mini 14 rifle, .223 caliber, Thompson Contender pistol, which can have interchangeable barrels, including a .223, and evidence that connected him back to the homicide victims, including clothing and jewelry. Hansen's weapon of choice was a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. It's a semi-automatic .223 caliber. It's lightweight. It's short. In Bob Hansen's words, what he said is, "I like small caliber, high-velocity rifles." Some of the shells that were collected from the shallow graves at Knik River were connected back to the .223 caliber rifle that they found in Bob Hansen's attic. Bob Hansen's airplane was a Super Cub. If you notice, the front tires on the Super Cub are large. They can land on beaches, lake beaches, ocean beaches, river beaches. This map shows the flight pattern that Bob Hansen would fly from Merrill Field in downtown Anchorage to Knik River. On February 27, 1984, Bob Hansen was convicted of homicide. He was eventually sentenced to 461 years plus life in jail by Judge Ralph Moody. He died in jail in 2014. He was suspect in many more homicides than he admitted to. Several of Bob Hansen's victims of homicide were involved in human trafficking. The district attorney assigned to the case, Frank Rothschild, said that the system had failed the public, which allowed Bob Hansen to prey on women for a long long time. The status today in the topic of Alaska serial killers, human trafficking, and MMIP. The question is, after Bob Hansen was sent to jail, did serial killers stop in Alaska? The answer is no. In recent times, there's been at least 6 active serial killers with over 60 victims, including Thomas Richard Bundy. In 2003, bodies of 2 people involved in human trafficking were found in the mudflats off of South Anchorage. Joshua Wade, Israel Keys, James Dale Ritchie, and Jessica Spade. There's been an average over the past 50 years of around 1 serial killing victim in Alaska per year. The new outlier is Jessica Spade, a nurse practitioner from Eagle River. Between 2014 and 2019, she had 450 patients and dispensed between 4 million and 18 million pills. No alcohol, guns, or tobacco involved, just pain pills predominantly. She was responsible for at least 5 deaths, maybe 20 deaths or more. Pen is mightier than the sword, to quote Assistant U.S. Attorney Ryan Tansey. Jessica Spade was a serial killer with a poisonous pen. And then nationwide, the Radford Florida Gulf Coast University, they have a serial killer database which began in 1992, and they have over 5,753 subjects in their database, the largest non-government serial murder database in the world. 10 ominous signs of serial killers noted by Dr. Louis Schlesinger from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Serial killers are often victims of child abuse, inappropriate maternal sexual conduct, pathological lying and manipulation, sadistic fantasy with compulsion to act, animal cruelty, especially against cats, the need to control and dominate others, repeated fire setting, voyeurism, fetishes, sex-motivated crimes, unprovoked attacks on females, evidence of ritualistic or signature behavior. In 2019, Melody Schreiber published her research. She focused on possible connections between youth homelessness and human trafficking. She surveyed 10 cities. She found that Anchorage had the highest rates of human trafficking and youth homelessness, with 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys at Covenant House reported being victims of human trafficking. Melody Schreiber noticed that Alaska human trafficking is a serious topic, but it's mostly invisible, below the radar. Alaska Natives and American people suffer disproportionate homicide rates, with 3.2 times that of non-native people in Alaska. The Alaska State Troopers have 1,325 people listed as missing persons, with an overrepresentation of American Indian and Alaska Native. The Alaska State Trooper cold case homicides report that there's 68 cold case homicides in Alaska between 1961 and 2001. Anchorage Crime Stoppers, 40 unsolved homicides in Anchorage. Available services for Alaska survivors of crime include the Alaska Office of Victims' Rights, the Alaska Native Justice Center, the Alaska Institute for Justice, Covenant House, Standing Together Against Rape, Abused Women Aid in Crisis, Unalaska Against Sexual Assault and Family Violence, VINE. I've worked with people in all of these agencies, and they are compassionate people who want to help victims of crime and to reduce the number of Alaskans who suffer from being victims of crime. On June 8th, 2023, the United States Attorney's Office announced that they're appointing 3 Indian County Assistant Attorneys to assist in the investigation of MMIP in Alaska, to keep communities safe and pursue justice for American Indian and Alaska Native families. 5 practical crime prevention tips. Number 1, file a flight plan. Let people know where you're going and who's going to be with you. What's your route? How long will you be there? What emergency equipment will you have? When do you expect to return? There's safety in numbers. 2 is an important number. Always take a safety buddy with you. Alaska Court View is available to the public at no cost. You don't need a username or ID. You can look up any person at any time, and if they say they're a good person but they have criminal history that escalates, going from traffic violations to misdemeanors to felonies to crimes against persons, maybe they're not the best of people to hang around, especially if they've got multiple reports of domestic violence assaults, multiple domestic violence restraining orders filed against them. I've also listed additional sources, including a sex offender registry in Alaska, sex offender registration nationwide, teachers who've misbehaved, professors who've misbehaved, Alaska State Trooper warrants, agency news from the FBI, Department of Justice, United States Marshal, Alaska State Troopers, and Anchorage Police Department. So these are all available resources. I encourage you to do your homework to check people out that you might be hanging around or that your friends or family might be hanging around. They quite often portray themselves as good people, but if you look at their criminal history, there's sometimes reason to be concerned. Make sure you confirm identification. There's quite often people in Alaska that have the same name and even similar dates of birth, so confirm identification. And also remember that all people are considered innocent until proven otherwise in a court of law. Surveillance cameras are increasingly catching people actively involved in crime in Alaska, including serial killing, double homicides, the shooting of a hibernating sow and her cubs in a den in Alaska, porch arson, where a man walks up to a porch and with a container of fuel, pours the fuel and ignites it. A death in Eagle River, Kenai homicide, double homicide in Metlakatla, and a homicide in Anchorage. All of these crimes were captured on video camera or audio. In 2014, the tragic double homicide of 2 Alaska State Troopers. The more surveillance cameras in Alaska, the more crimes that are going to be caught, and the more the crime's going to be reduced. Criminals aren't fools. They know when there's cameras around. So these doorbell cameras are relatively inexpensive. So I encourage you to consider installing surveillance cameras that can help catch crime and can help reduce crime in Alaska. Pay attention to what we watch, listen to. If we watch media that normalizes crime against women, against indigenous people, or against people involved in human trafficking, it becomes normalized, and it's easier for people to commit those crimes. And so maybe it's time that we change what we view, what we read, what we listen to. It's time to uplift and honor victims of crime. Tip number 5 is to harden the target. For 10,000 years, Alaska elders have raised Alaska Native youth, training for battle, training for fighting, training for war. It's a long Alaska Native tradition to train our youth in physical strength training, physical agility training, to train it to work in teams, combat training to fight to win, whether we're being attacked by humans or animals, to be vigilant of our surroundings and our domain. It's important to acknowledge who took down Alaska's most prolific serial killer, who took down Bob Hansen. It was a 17-year-old. In conclusion, compassion and care are essential. In the olden days, we blamed the victim, saying that could never happen to me. Today, we care for the victim. We realize that could have happened to me. Let's help heal, deal with underlying issues. Let's provide needed services, support, and encouragement for our victims of crime so that they can get back in the battle and help make our community a better and safer community. In conclusion, information is power. I hope this presentation has increased your awareness about serial killers in Alaska, about human trafficking, and about MMIP. I hope this presentation has increased your compassion and understanding. I hope that you know that information is power. With information, we can improve our communities and make it safer for everyone. It's important to point out that the Anchorage Police Department has greatly increased their diversity over the years. They've improved their capabilities to investigate crime. They've improved, in my opinion, their compassion for victims of crime. I'd like to say Kagasakun, thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, my email address is mikell@apiai.org. I'd like to say Kagasakun to the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association and the Alaska Native Justice Center and the STOP grant for sponsoring this training. Please take the pre-post survey so that I might issue you a certificate of training. Please continue your research and learning. Information is power. In particular, I encourage you to find the book Butcher Baker by Walt Gilmore and Leland Hale. Take the time to find that book and to read it cover to cover, and then to find the other resources that I've listed here. I'm going to back up a few slides to my contact information, and I'm going to stop this recording so that you might feel free to ask questions or to give comments. So, Kagasakun, thank you for your attention.